Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shantan Pomik, and my topic for my essay would be global terrorism and its role in international relations. I should start by defining what terrorism is. Terrorism is basically the threat of violence and fear to coerce or gain or persuade the public attention, to gain public attention. There are various different types of terrorism, but I'll be only discussing 6 different types of terrorism in my essay. That will be state terrorism, sub-state terrorism, the new terrorism, international terrorism, dissident terrorism, and ideological terrorism. There are 3 factors to why terrorism is caused. The one is political factors, there's another one that's economic factors, and there's the social factors. The political factors mostly accounts for government repression. Most people misunderstand that government repression happens during authoritarian regime. That is true, but if you're looking at when non-state actors engage in terrorism activities, it mostly happens during a transition period from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. And a prime example of this would be Libya, when Gaddafi was overthrown and the new democratic power was gained. The next would be economic factors. Economic factors account for poverty, economic sanctions, unemployment, which all creates dissatisfaction with the individual's current economic state, because they mostly believe that the government should be the one who should be taking care of them. But if the government fails through economic ways, then they could project their own voices through terrorist activities. The next would be social factors. Social factors only takes into account of one thing, the level of your education. The main prime example of how this could be conducted is through Human Development Index, and we also take into factor of the religion context. The Human Development Index tells us how developed the mind is and how resilient we could be towards terrorism. And religion can also play a huge factor. For instance, now mostly the terrorism that's happening in the world is through the use of Islam in Middle Eastern countries. Now, I will also discuss on the psychology on global terrorism. To understand the psychology of terrorism, we must look at it through a radicalization approach. There are 2 approaches to this. One is called multifinality, and the other is called ecofinality. Multifinality is when one factor can lead to several outcomes. For instance, if you're exposed to any radical extreme content, it could lead to radical views, it could lead to involvement in terrorism, it could lead to anti-terrorism activity and self-harm. For instance, the best example is, in social media, you can find different sorts of content. There could be extreme content, and that content can persuade any viewer, and that person could somehow adopt into extremist views. It could be any political view or any extremist religious views or any sort of. The other thing is ecofinality. This is when the same outcome can come from multiple predictors. An example would be a radical mindset can come from economic trouble, social upheaval, foreign occupation, political discontent, presidential tweets, and religious indoctrination. Now, we should know, I will also talk about what terrorists have in common. All terrorists have 4 things in common. First is, they're outraged at some perceived injustice. They feel that violence is the only way to right their wrongs. Violence is one thing, it's also seen as a strategy of getting something done. Many people, they come from tough backgrounds. They could be psychological or physical trauma, and from that they could also adopt the thinking that violence is the only way to achieve what they want. That's one reason. The other thing is they have a particular mindset and they work hard to convince themselves and also others that what they're doing is necessary and urgent. They believe also that their actions will bring a better future for themselves and for the rest of the people. Now I shall talk about also the effects on terrorism and on economic security. See, on economic security, it also goes back to the economic factors, but this talks about the after consequences of what terrorism can do. First thing what it can do is that it can reduces capital shock to a country, increasing in counterterrorism expenditure. For instance, for instance, America after 9/11 happened, they started spending. The government started spending a lot on security, on the security apparatus, where they had to deal with how to effectively counterattack against the terrorism activities. With this, government spending would mostly be included into the security, will be converged towards the security aspect, and government spending would not be done in other industries, for instance, tourism or healthcare or any sort of, which would lead to an economic decline in gross national product. Also, which would also lead to the country having more the capital, like also will lead to a spillover effect. The neighboring countries will notice that there has been a decline in economic activity due to the increase in terrorism, which would also dissuade capital inflow into the country. The terrorism impact on international relations. Mostly the impact is on globalization. With an increased globalization, as more countries are being more interconnected towards each other, as the boundaries that states have has been slowly dissolved, technology, trade, and more connectivity has been happening. This has been more easier for terrorist organizations to operate. For instance, as I go back again to the example of 9/11, they used local resources in a particular country that they were trying to target to which happened to be more efficient. For instance, in 9/11, they used two airplanes, which were American airplanes, to attack the world towers. Terrorism's impacts on international relations could also consider factors such as technology. Technology has been a factor which has been an advantage also to terrorists, as they have been able to gain more public attention through social media accounts as something called cyber warfare. There's also, since the world becomes more globalized, the concept is that the world will be shifting from a state-centric approach to a more individual approach, which also means the threat will shift from the state towards the individual, which is a serious and a more complex approach, and it's much more threatening than the previous version. As also, since globalization would happen, more privatization of each resources and so forth would happen, which means that state control would be less regulated into various private organizations. And such private organizations would include defense production, and defense production in the private players would go mostly to people who could afford them. Hence, it would also deal with supplies that go to terrorism and terrorist organizations, such as in Pakistan. In Pakistan, the America condemns terrorism, but yet somehow there are various companies coming from America who supply defense chains to particular terrorist organizations. Now, I shall also be talking about what could be done to counter terrorism from the international arena. If you look at it from an international perspective, then all states must collectively accept that terrorism is a real threat and must work together to fight terrorism. Also, another approach must be taken is the international system should take an approach of multilateralism. This is where power would be diverged. It wouldn't be only towards the global north, but more power will be given to the global south, which themselves would be working against terrorism and also enhance their own security threats. For instance, Africa is the most vulnerable one towards security terrorist threats. The other one would be to condemn governments which impose harm over their own civilians, which enrages people to fight back through violence. Basically, one of the accounts that terrorism could happen is when the government, as a political factor, when government represses their own people, and if people are repressed, then they would fight back against it. through violent means, and that violent means could be terrorism. From a domestic arena, I shall be discussing only two things. First thing, from a domestic perspective, if any suspected activity is found within any country, it should be reported. It could be a friend or a family. This is the tricky part because a lot of people are scared for themselves that they won't be able to discuss, they won't be able to report because they themselves are in danger of themselves from the terrorist or a suspected terrorist. Another thing that the governments should at least enhance their security apparatus in times of increased terror activities. If it's happening at a more constant time, more people are in danger, then the government should focus more on security threats. This includes counterintelligence, counter law enforcement, and many forms. This is all I have to talk about terrorism. I hope you enjoy my presentation. Thank you very much.